What does the moderate sensitive invariantist say? What is their view of knowledge? Just because that's a long name, I'm just going to call him the invariantist from now on, and probably for the rest of the lecture. Well, the invariantist says that whether you can be truly said to know something depends on two things. First of all, it depends on what your evidence is like. It depends on your epistemic situation. But it also importantly depends on your practical situation. I won't say just yet what I mean by a practical situation, but just take it for now that it involves things like what you're paying attention to and what kinds of decisions you have to make. That's roughly what your practical situation is. So these two things go into determining whether you know something, according to the invariantist. So, although this isn't by any means a definition, we might say that you know P just in case you have the right evidence for P, and you're also in the right practical situation. And of course this opens up the possibility that two people could have exactly the same evidence with respect to P. They could both have enough evidence to know P, but differ according to whether they know P because they're in different practical situations. It could be that one of them is in the right practical situation to know P, and therefore does, and the other is in the wrong practical situation, and so doesn't know P. This all being true, even though they have exactly the same evidence. Now, the obvious question to ask is, how is this really different from contextualism? Because we said some very similar things when we were talking about contextualism. We said that whether somebody could be truly said to know something depends not only on their evidence, but certain features of some practical situation. To put it a bit more concretely, we said that on the contextualist theory, the claim S knows that P is true in a context just in case S's evidence rules out all the relevant not P worlds, the worlds that are relevant in the context. And we said already that, among other things, it looks like the practical situation of the context is part of what determines what's relevant in that context. So how are these views really different? Well, one big difference is in exactly whose practical situation are we looking at. Because contextualism doesn't just say that we look at a particular practical situation. It also takes a stand on whose practical situation is relevant. And as we've said a few times now, it says it's the practical situation of whoever is doing the talking. Because remember, what's relevant, the worlds that are relevant in a context, that's determined by the speaker in the context. So insofar as the practical situation is relevant for the truth of a knowledge claim, it's through what's relevant to and what the practical situation of the speaker in the context is. This is not what invariantists say. Invariantists say that the practical situation that's relevant is the practical situation of whoever that you're talking about. So if I'm talking about what Alice knows, it's Alice's practical situation that's relevant whenever we're trying to figure out whether she knows something or not. These two things will clearly come apart when there's a difference in who's doing the talking and who is being talked about. Or to put it differently, it'll become clearer how these two things are different when we focus on third-person ascriptions. When we think about ourselves as speakers talking about some third party who's in a different context to us. This is exactly the kind of case in which the two views are going to say different things about whether somebody can be truly said to know something or not. And we're going to focus on that and see that point in a bit more detail in just a moment. But the second thing we might say about how these two views are different is a sort of deeper underlying difference that gives rise to this difference in predictions on third-person ascriptions. Because one way of thinking about what the contextualist says is that, well, the practical situation determines what you mean when you use the word knows. But once you've figured out what proposition you're asserting when you use the word knows, it's completely down to epistemic factors, whether that proposition is true or not. So we do need to look at the practical situation of whoever is doing the talking to figure out whether, whose standards are relevant. So if I'm in a low standards context, when I say that Alice knows P, that determines that I mean Alice knows relative to low standards that P. So my standards determine what the word knows means in my mouth. But once we've figured out what the proposition is, whether or not the proposition is true or not is completely determined by the epistemic standing of the person you're talking about. So whether or not it's true that Alice knows relative to low standards that P is completely determined by Alice's evidence. You don't need to know anything about Alice beyond her evidence to know whether she knows according to low standards that P. Again, this is very different to what the invariantist is going to say. What they will say is that actually context plays no role at all in determining what knows means. The word knows means the same thing in everybody's mouth. There's no context sensitivity in the word knows. But in fact, when you are just considering the proposition whether somebody knows something, the truth of that is not totally determined just by the epistemic status. So when we want to ask whether Alice knows that it's raining, for instance, that is not totally determined by what her evidence is. It's also determined by what practical situation she's in. So in the two views, the role of the practical situation is very different. For the contextualist, the role of the practical situation is in figuring out exactly what the word knows means in your mouth. Once that is done, it's totally down to the epistemic status of the subject, whether the proposition holds or not. On the invariantist view, context plays no role at all in figuring out what the word knows means. The sentence, Alice knows that it's raining, means the same thing in every single context. However, whether or not that proposition is true is partly determined by the practical situation. So this is the deeper difference between invariantism and contextualism. So we're going to unpack these things a little bit more. What we're going to do is we're going to look at some third-person examples to get a better grip on how these views make different predictions. We'll also be able to see better what this difference, this deeper underlying difference I just mentioned, amounts to. We're now going to see how these views differ by looking in more detail at this issue about third-person attributions. So for the moment, let's just take the practical situation for somebody just to be the stakes of the situation they're in. Where I take the stakes to be basically how important is it that the proposition is true or not. So there are two basic different kinds of situations we might be in. In one situation, when we're making a knowledge claim, the ascriber might have the same stakes as the person they're talking about, the subject of the claim, or there might be different stakes. The ascriber's stakes might be different from the subject's stakes. And of course, each of these two break into two further subcases. So in one, where the stakes are the same, it could be because they both have high stakes, or it could be because they both have low stakes. In the other case, it could be because the ascriber has high stakes and the subject has low stakes, or it could be that the ascriber has low stakes and the subject has high stakes. The kind of case we'll focus on is the bank case that we talked about a few weeks ago. So remember, in this case, Alice and Billy are at the bank. They're about to deposit a check, but the line is very, very long, so they're wondering about whether they should just leave it for today and come back next week. And Billy says, on the basis of his having been there a few weeks ago and the bank being open on a Saturday, that he knows the bank is going to be open next Saturday. And the question we're going to ask is, what do these different views say about whether his claim is true or not? Now, in the original case, we saw two versions of the case. One where the standards are low, where the stakes are low, because it doesn't matter whether the check is cashed today. And another version of it where the stakes are high because it's very important that the check is indeed cashed that day, or before the end of the weekend. So that's a variation in the stakes of the subject, because remember, Billy is the person that we're talking about. But we can imagine that the ascriber, their stakes are going to vary in the same way. So here, we'll just imagine that the person talking is me. So I'm the ascriber. We're evaluating the claim as made in my context, that Billy knows the bank is going to open next Saturday. And we'll imagine I'm in a similar situation of cashing a check. So I may or may not be in a higher low stakes situation, depending on whether the check I'm about to cash is important or not. So we're focusing on this claim that Billy knows the bank will be open next Saturday. And we have the four different kinds of cases that I mentioned. This is the case where the standards are the same because they're both low. Their stakes could be both high, or it could be that Billy's stakes are high, mine are low, or vice versa. So remember again throughout that we're imagining that I'm the ascriber. I'm the one who's saying this claim. Just to get these quick cases out of the way quickly, it's going to be straightforward enough to see that they're going to make exactly the same predictions. Let's focus on this case first. We'll get the two cases with the standards are the same out of the way quickly. So according to the contextualist, this claim as said by me in this case is true. Because for it to be true, Billy has to know according to low standards. Because remember, I'm the one it's my standards that determine what propositions it says. If my standards are low because the stakes are low, this means Billy knows, according to low standards, the bank will be open next Saturday. And that's indeed true in this situation. So contextualism says it's true. What about invariantism? Well, invariantism is going to give the same answer, because whether the stakes are low or high is going to make it either easier or harder to know something on the invariantist view. So the lower the stakes are, the less evidence you need in order to count as knowing something. But we said that the stakes are low for Billy, and so even though maybe his evidence isn't super great, it's going to be enough for him to count as knowing. So we give the same answer because the stakes are exactly the same. The reasons are maybe slightly different in each case, but we get the same answer when the stakes are the same. In this case, where the stakes are both high, the answer is that both views say this claim is false. On the contextualism, the claim is false because if I am in a high stakes context and I say this, what I mean is Billy knows, according to high standards, that the bank will be open next Saturday. But remember, when we set up the case, it's sort of part of the case that Billy's evidence is not super strong. It's maybe strong enough to know something in an ordinary case, but not strong enough to know something when the stakes get high. So according to the contextualist, it's going to be false, because this sentence expresses the proposition that he knows on high standards, but he doesn't. Invariantism again gives the same answer, because invariantists say, remember, the higher the stakes, the harder it is to know. Billy's evidence isn't super good, so putting those two things together, the invariantist is going to give the same answer. Okay, so far the views align, and as I said already, it's going to be in these two cases where they come apart. So this is where all the action is. So let's first think through what's going on in this case. This is the case where the stakes for Billy are high, but the stakes for me, the person doing the talking, are low. So first of all, what does contextualism say about the truth of this claim? Is it true that Billy knows the bank will be open next Saturday? Well, according to contextualism, even though Billy's standards are high, remember, it's not Billy who determines what the sentence means. It's me, because I'm the one doing the talking. So as said by me, because the stakes are low for me, this means that Billy knows, according to low standards, or given low standards, that the bank will be open next Saturday. And this is indeed true, because in the two variations of the case, his evidence is the same. All that changes is just the stakes. So if it was true in the earlier case that he knows, given low standards, it's still going to be true here that he knows, given low standards. So the contextualist answer is that in this variation, this sentence is true. Because as said by me, it means that Billy knows, given low standards, that the bank will be open next Saturday. And that's true. They just happen to be not Billy's own standards. What about the invariantist? Well, remember now, the invariantist says that this doesn't express different propositions, but whether or not it's true depends on the stakes of the subject. So to determine whether this is true, we need to look at this, both the subject stakes and their evidence, and say, well, is their evidence enough to know given their practical situation? And that here, for the same reasons as before, it looks like the answer is going to be no. That in fact this claim is not true here. Because the kind of context Billy is in, or the kind of situation that he's in, his practical situation, is such that whenever you're in that situation, you actually require a lot of evidence to know something, according to the invariantist. So according to the invariantist, this claim, even as said by me, is false. Because even as said by me, the determining factor here is going to be what are Billy's own stakes like? What are his own standards like? And in fact, they're high, and given his high standards, his actual evidence is not going to be enough for this to be true. Let's go to the last case, where Billy's own standards are low, but my standards are high. And the judgments here are just the inverse of what we saw before. So just as contextualism said the sentence is true here, it's going to say it's false here. Because remember, now I, the person who's doing the talking, am in a high stakes context. So as said by me, this means that Billy knows, on high standards, that the bank will be open next Saturday. But we know that that's not true, because his evidence isn't good enough for him to know by high standards that the bank will be open by next Saturday. So that's why the sentence is false in this situation. What about the invariantist? Well, remember again, the invariantist says there's no change in meaning in what this sentence says. Rather, it's what the person's standards are like, what their stakes are like, that determine how much evidence they need to count as knowing something. And we said Billy's stakes are low in this variation of the case. This is the case where it's not super important that the check be cashed that day. So even though my standards are high, it doesn't matter. The only person whose standards matter, according to the invariantist, are the person who you're talking about. And since their standards are low, it doesn't take that much to count as knowing. So Billy indeed does count as knowing. So I hope now this sort of brings out the differences between the views. Of course, when the standards of the scriber and the subject are the same, there's going to be no difference between the views. But when the standards differ, then we get very different predictions. Because remember, invariantism says the standards that matter are those of the person that you're talking about. Whereas contextualism basically says the standards that matter are the ones of the person doing the talking. We can also notice one further thing by looking at this chart, which is that once you fix, according to the invariantist, once you fix the standards of the person you're talking about, it doesn't actually matter what the standards of the person doing the talking are. So this is the case where Billy's standards are low and my standards are low. This is the case where Billy's standards are low and my standards are high. And we can see that the view gives the same answer in both cases. All the view cares about is the standards of the person that you're talking about. And for this reason, invariantists say that when you're thinking about the claim whether somebody knows something, the answer to that is going to be the same in every single context. Because the answer is always determined by the actual situation of the person that you're talking about. So no matter what context you're in, whether it's true to say of that person that they know is determined by what things are like for them and not for you. This is very different from what the contextualist says. Because notice here, even when we're keeping Billy's standards low, depending what things are like for me, the answer to whether this sentence is true can be very different. If my standards are low, then I'll agree that Billy knows that the bank will be open. On the other hand, even if the standards remain the same, but if I change to be in a high stakes context, now the sentence is going to be false, as said by me. So for the contextualist, whether the sentence is true or not depends a lot on the context in which it's said. For the invariantist, the truth of the sentence has nothing to do with the context in which it's said. It's always just determined by the situation of the person that you're talking about. I said there were two differences between invariantism and contextualism. One of them was the difference we just saw, which is this business about third-person attributions and how they make different predictions. But there's also a difference in how the propositions associated with sentences are made true. And that's something we can now actually see, given that we've talked about third-person attributions. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a picture both of how the contextualist thinks this works and of how the invariantist thinks this works. And this is hopefully going to illustrate the difference in where the practical situation comes in. So let's focus on the kind of case we had before. We have the sentence, Billy knows the bank is open. And we're going to think about what, according to the contextualist, happens when this is first asserted in a context, depending on how the stakes are, and then what happens to the truth value of the resulting proposition. So remember, the very first part of the contextualist story is that, well, in order to know what this sentence says, you've got to figure out what context was it said in. In particular, what is the practical situation of the person who's saying it. So let's just focus on two options. We can imagine that the context had low standards, or we can imagine the context had high standards. And depending on what the context is like, contextualism is going to say a different proposition was asserted. So if the context was one of low standards, then the proposition asserted will be that Billy knows, according to low standards, that the bank is open. I'm just going to write ... here and let you fill in this bit for yourself. So in a low standards context, this is the proposition that's asserted. And of course, in a high standard context, a different proposition is asserted, namely the proposition that Billy knows, according to high standards, that the bank is open. So the role of the standards is to tell us what proposition was asserted. Are we saying that Billy knows on low standards, or are we saying that he knows on high standards? That's the role of the practical situation. Of course, once we have the proposition, we then need to ask, well, is the resulting proposition true or false? And what we'll do here is, just as before, we'll imagine that we have two different kinds of scenarios, Well, imagine that Billy's evidence is the same in both scenarios. So in both scenarios, he has kind of, not a great amount of evidence, but that his own stakes are different. So in the first case, this is a case where the stakes for Billy are low, maybe because it's not important that the check is cashed. This is a case where the standards are high for Billy, and the same here. Billy low, Billy high. So we have these propositions according to contextualism, and now we need to say, well, in what situations are they true or not? Well, remember, in all of these situations, we're saying that Billy has the same evidence, namely not hugely strong evidence. And for the proposition that Billy knows by low standards, this is really all that's needed. So it doesn't matter what his standards are like. If the proposition is he knows by low standards, as long as he has a sufficient amount of evidence, which we're imagining he does, the proposition that he knows by low standards will be true. So it doesn't matter what Billy's actual standards are like himself. In both cases, the proposition is true, because it's built into the proposition itself what the relevant standards are. The proposition is not saying, look at what Billy's actual standards are. It's already built in that we want to know whether he knows by low standards. A similar pattern emerges here. So here, if we say this in a high-stakes context, then it's the proposition that Billy knows, given high standards, that the bank is open. Remember again, we said he has kind of middling evidence, and what evidence he has is not dependent on his stakes, his practical situation. It's the same in both cases. And the result now is that the proposition is false, because Billy doesn't have the kind of evidence that would enable him to know by high standards. It doesn't matter what his actual standards are like, because again, the standards are built into the proposition. The proposition is saying, I want to know whether Billy knows by high standards. So it doesn't matter what his actual standards are like, because his evidence is not great in both of these cases, he doesn't know by high standards. So this illustrates an important feature of contextualism that I mentioned in one of the earlier videos. I said that there's a big difference between contextualism and invariantism in how the standards, how the practical situation enters into the truth of a given sentence. And here we see that the role of the practical situation, the role of the standards, is just to tell you what proposition are you asserting. Are you asserting that he knows low, or are you asserting that he knows high? But once you assert that proposition, there's no further role for standards. Given that Billy's evidence is the same in both cases, this proposition is going to be true in both cases. Given that, again, that Billy's evidence is the same in both cases here, this other proposition is going to be false in both cases. Once we've determined what the proposition is, whether that proposition is true or not is completely determined by Billy's evidence. So that's the contextualist picture. Standards or practical situations are used to determine what's said. It's used to determine the content of the sentence in the context. But once you have the context, then all you need to know is the evidence to figure out whether that proposition is true or not in a given situation. This is quite different from what happens with invariantism. So now let's look at another picture, one which illustrates how things work in an invariantist picture. So again, we're going to work with the sentence, Billy knows the bank is open. Again, we're going to find out the proposition it expresses in the different contexts, and then we're going to evaluate that proposition in different versions of Billy's case. So again, they're both going to be cases where his evidence is the same. It's sort of a low, middling amount of evidence, but we're going to vary what the stakes are like. So let's first start with going from a context to a proposition. So again, we have a context where the standards in the context are low, and a context where the standards in the context are high. And invariantism says there's no difference in the proposition that's expressed. The proposition that's expressed in the low context is the very same as the proposition that's expressed in the high context. That's exactly why it's called invariantism, because the proposition expressed in a given context does not vary. The meaning of knows does not vary according to the context of use. It's the very same proposition in both cases. The interesting bit is what happens when we look at the situations in which the proposition is being evaluated. So again, once we have our proposition, we need to look at the particular scenarios of interest and figure out, is the proposition true there or not? And here we notice a real difference with contextualism. Because on the moderate invariantist, what Billy's standards are like, what the standards of the situation are like, are very important indeed. According to the invariantist, this proposition is true in a case where Billy's stakes are low. In the kind of practical situation that Billy is in here, all he needs is a sort of lowish amount of evidence for the proposition to be true. By contrast, when Billy's stakes are high, when that's his practical situation, this proposition is false. Because remember, it's part of the view that the higher the stakes, the more that is required in order to know something. So unlike contextualism, once you have the proposition expressed by a sentence using knows, you need to know more than just what somebody's evidence is like in order to know whether that proposition is true or not. I can't tell you whether this proposition is true, even if you tell me what Billy's evidence is like, if you don't tell me what his practical situation is like also, according to the invariantist. Because if his standards are low, then the proposition will be true if he has sort of middling evidence, but it will be false if he's in a high stakes case. So this is the difference I mentioned again in what makes the propositions true. We said on contextualism, once you have the proposition, the standards play no further role. The evidence does all the determining of truth or falsity. The situation is flipped here. Here, the standards play no role at all in figuring out what proposition is said, because it's the same proposition in every context. Instead, they play a big role in determining whether that proposition is true or not. You can't tell me whether the proposition is true on the invariantist view, even if you tell me the subject's evidence, without also telling me what their practical situation is like, because you're going to get different answers depending on whether they're in, say, a high-stakes case or a low-stakes case.